Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Global in the Local, A Century of War, Commerce, and Technology in China, by Xin Zhang, narrated by David Lee Huynh. Introduction. Understanding Global Changes in China. An important question for students of Chinese history is how to ascertain changes in China in the global context that produced the rise of modern imperialism, intensified economic integration, and the spread of mechanized technology from Europe and North America during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The difficulty in answering this question derives from the fact that some of the changes were entangled with the aspirations for global dominance of the industrialized countries in Europe, North America, and later Japan. Based on successful military campaigns against the Qing dynasty, these countries deeply penetrated Chinese society, subjugating most Chinese people to their economic interests and imperial ambitions. Still, during the same period, aided by mechanized technology, China embarked on a transformation that extended its economic linkages to the rest of the globe. Because this segment of Chinese history is interwoven with those industrialized countries, it has been a challenge for us to ferret out the changes in China that reflected a deeper level of global transition beneath the surface, while also observing the changes that followed the country's specific historical trajectory. We have been confronted with this challenge since the inception of China studies as an academic field in the United States, and it is therefore helpful to explore the scholarship on the three components of this study: the Opium War, trade, and technology over the past decades. Until the late 1970s, Chinese historians were under the influence of the Eurocentric and teleological view of global change inherent in the grand narrative of the rise of the West. Much of the early work rested on the assumption that China had to depend on stimuli from countries in Europe and North America to modernize. After the late 1970s until the early 1990s, China studies were focused on internal changes, ignoring much of the Chinese history related to global changes, a trend that continued especially after Paul Cohen highlighted a China-centered approach. Regarding the Opium War, aside from European imperialism, attention focused on how the Qing dynasty and its Middle Kingdom mindset interacted with the West while treating the opium trade as part of its tributary system. As many U.S. scholars had, by the late 1960s, moved their investigation to the question of how China attempted to strengthen itself after defeat, still framing it as China's response to the West. Frederick Wakeman's 1966 Strangers at the Gate was a sharp departure. For the first time, a work examined the war's effect on local society, especially as a cause for the Taiping Rebellion. By highlighting the social and economic changes after the war that underlay rural disorder, secret society activities, and widespread discontent, Wakeman not only brought attention to the interconnectedness between the war and local society, but also paid specific attention to the merchants, gentry, and villagers deeply impacted by the changes. Soon thereafter, the rise of social history saw historians in the United States not only moving away from such previously popular subjects as regime change, political figures, and leading intellectuals, but also focusing on local societies. Social historians set out to rediscover societies locale by locale, which eventually led to a much better understanding of the world. However, by design, social history was not disposed to address the big questions, as Lynn Hunt calls them, as global changes. In China studies, social history had already started to take hold in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Paul Cohen's advocacy of a China-centered approach coincided with the gradual opening of local archives in China. Between the late 1970s and early 1990s, the field saw many significant achievements in social and economic history and local society. However, most scholars shied away from topics like the Opium War to avoid an association with a Western-centric view of Chinese history. New cultural history sparked a great deal of interest among historians on China in the 1990s, but none of the resulting studies targeted the war directly. As part of post-colonial discourse, some historians on China saw in the Opium War an opportunity to re-examine issues of Western imperialism. However, they paid little attention to the people in the local society. There has been renewed interest in the Opium War after James Hevier's work, and there is a clear trend toward using personal records such as memoirs, personal correspondence, and private journals to tell the story. Aided by these new sources, scholars have addressed the significant role of various individuals in the war. Several studies present a Chinese perspective in which individual character and morals mattered as much as the diplomatic missteps and military weakness of the Qing dynasty. Others relate the war to the cultural context in which the British interacted with China, from gift exchange to etiquette practices. Despite their contributions, these studies concentrated exclusively on Qing officials or individuals like European travelers and missionaries. Recently, more and more historians have begun to study the experiences of ordinary people in other wars. A study of people's experiences in the Opium War will thus enable us to better grasp the meaning of the war as a tool of modern imperialism. While the influence of social history resulted in a loss of scholarly interest in the Opium War, work on the Chinese commercial system benefited from it. Nevertheless, the focus was not on the transformation of the system or people's experiences as China was confronting immense pressure from global changes. It was the structure of China's commercial system that received the most consideration from researchers like G. William Skinner, who argued that, due to insurmountable geographical barriers, most trade activities were conducted macro-regionally, with each macro-region rather than between them. Skinner insists there was only a limited amount of trans-regional trade activity between macro-regions before the end of the 19th century, albeit a great deal existed along the Yangzi River. A national level of market integration only surfaced when modern technology was available, after the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. Its immense popularity notwithstanding, Skinner's model received criticism for the lack of attention to human agency. One of the critics was William Rowe, who argued for the power of the social network that allowed trade groups to link with one another across macro-regions, an argument buttressed not only by American scholars, but also by leading researchers in China. Some have shown that what Skinner considered a discrete macro-region was part of a much larger trade zone stretching to South Asia. Others have pointed out the existence of cross-regional trade activities. Recently, a growing number of historians have begun to realize that localities in China were not bounded territories. There were already significant translocal activities during the period. But these studies are not targeting questions regarding the transformation of the commercial system during intense global changes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As some Chinese historians debated the structure of China's commercial system, a group of scholars attempted to answer questions related to China's commercial transition from the perspective of Western penetration of China through a focus on the treaty ports. Most concluded that the Western infiltration of the ports had little impact on the native Chinese economy, especially in rural, interior China. Later, Thomas Roski supported that conclusion. After Roski, more research was devoted to treaty ports, but the new studies did not address China's commercial transformation amid global changes. Alongside the treaty port conversation, there was discussion among several Japanese scholars who study intra-Asia trade and shed light on how Chinese treaty ports connected to the commercial networks of Asia, with links into the country's interior. Kaoru Sugihara considers the growth of intra-Asian trade the result of Asian producers and merchants who responded to trade opportunities, not the consequence of Western penetration, especially after the Dutch and English East India companies, as well as the Qing rulers, relaxed restrictions on trade. Takeshi Hamashita showed that the intrusion of the Euro-American economy did not alter the regional trade system. Rather, it lost itself within the system. He discovered not only the connection between traditional Chinese tributary system and the global changes that led to the creation of treaty ports in Asia, but also the way trade in East Asia was linked through the treaty ports, the hinterland of open ports, and coastal regions. One important question was, when in the 19th century did the major transition in China's trade system occur? Whereas Skinner and Rowe both deemed the 1880s the beginning of that transition, Hamashita marks the mid-19th century as the turning point. The difference comes from the fact that they have looked at two different aspects of long-distance trade, one within the territories of Chinese dynasties, trans-regional trade, and the other, the extension of the former to the rest of Asia. Another central issue revolves around the size of the cities that have been studied. Research interest has been slanted toward large cities, not the medium or small-sized cities that provide the crucial link between large cities and the vast countryside. Among the large cities that received attention, Shanghai tops the list, with more studies than all other cities combined. After Shanghai, one finds work on Beijing and Guangdong, Nanjing and Hong Kong, Tianjin and Macau. Medium or small cities have received much less attention. A short list includes places such as Nantong and Yangzhou. Still, in studies of large cities, There are plenty of considerations about the life of ordinary.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?